So without further ado, let's just hop right into it. First video we're gonna react to is Anthony Fantano of Needle Drop Clip, who we are fans of, and we check out and value and kind of respect his opinion. So we're gonna kind of see what he's talking about here in terms of there are no more bands. That is the title of this video.
Rock the Knee Band Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. I hope you guys are doing well. I caught a recent podcast clip off of the Rest is Entertainment podcast featuring Richard Osman and Marina Hyde, where they talked about an interesting phenomenon in the charts today. Essentially what Richard describes as the complete disappearance of bands from the chart. Not only rock bands, but bands of all sorts, be they jazz, electronic, folk, even large-scale pop outfits like One Direction, stuff like that. Though, the one anomaly kind of bucking that trend are all of these K-pop groups that are very popular and viral right now. But yes, for the most part, Richard...
That's funny because that's exactly what I was about to say. In terms of like bands and whatnot being around, like especially considering like pop bands, like they are still around. They've just shifted to other cultures and other environments. Like Korean pop is still a massive thing, and that's the same thing in a lot of Asian countries right now. It's like kind of these boy band and girl bands popping up, and bands in general. You can look at like what are they name, Baby Metal out of Japan. Like there are a lot of bands, maybe not in American mainstream music, but outside of like here, there are still very much a lot of bands.
Richard speaks of a complete disappearance of bands. Let's watch some of that clip.
And in the first half of the 1980s, there were 146 weeks when bands were number one. The first half of the 90s, there were 141 weeks. In the first 5 years of this decade, 3 weeks.
No.
We have had 3 number one weeks, one of which was the Beatles, when they had the lovely comeback single, and one of which was Little Mix. And that's the only kind of official band who've had a single week at number one in this entire decade.
Oh my God.
So,
I mean, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. Like the Beatles, honestly, just shout out to the Beatles that they're still putting out number one hits, considering that they have retired as a band like decades and decades and decades ago. You also kind of got to look at the current climate and landscape of things. Hip hop is still probably the biggest, well, it is the biggest, most popular genre at this moment, and there are not bands or groups in hip hop in the traditional sense. Most people in hip hop are solo acts, and that's kind of what's dominating. Pop stars are solo acts, aside from all the producers and engineers and writers that they have on their team. Ultimately, they are a solo front-facing act, and that's just kind of like the current shape of music these days.
So, I mean, the trends and the numbers are most certainly there. There's no denying that. There does seem to be a severe lack of bands in the charts these days. But I don't know if I would necessarily attribute it to some kind of like hyper individualization or anything, or really to anything.
I kind of would. I would, because it's more lucrative to make money. I mean, let's put it this way, like back in the day when bands were super popping and like you basically had to be in a band to even make it as a musician. It was because they were basically controlled fully by labels. They would find acts and artists and they would group them together and they put out music. And then if you got big enough, then you would break off as a solo act and kind of continue your career. A lot of people see that the money, the fame, the recognition is mostly coming from solo artists. And like, if you don't want it, and I mean, it's a huge reason why bands can't stick together, is the money. How do you share the money? How do you split the money? How do you share the fame? People have egos, and like, they're just skipping that step of going through this band to just going straight to solo artists. Beyonce did it. She was in a group, little girl group. Destiny's Child, very successful, but the money, the fame, like to really take your career to the next level, was being a solo artist.
That you could categorize as like societal degradation, or maybe even something nefarious per se. I think a lot of these significant changes just come down to the creative and musical economic paradigm shifting.
Not to mention, if I'm a manager, like how much easier is it to manage one person versus like 4 to 5 different people with all different personalities and things going on in their life? Like, ultimately, it is much easier to manage one person and to find one person than put together a whole group that can hopefully pop, honestly.
over the past couple of decades. I think we also have to stop and ask ourselves whether or not some of these individualization trends that we're seeing right now, were they not also prevalent to some degree in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s? I mean, most certainly they were, as solo artists are nothing new. There were plenty of them during those decades, and they were themselves marketable for very much the same reasons that solo artists today are marketable. You have an individual who is maybe charismatic, cool looking, sexy, easy to relate to. Maybe you even create some sort of weird parasocial obsession with them in your mind. Plus, on top of it, when you're talking about a lot of these bands that used to be maybe cult classics or high up on the charts, I mean, not only was it just the music, but often the very strong and notable and very memorable personalities behind these groups.
Front bands, like the front man, front woman has always been a thing since these 50s, 60s, 70s of kind of like contemporary, modern, popular music. It's, yeah, there was always bands, and there was always a group of artists, but there was always one person that stood out more than the others. And people are always going to kind of gravitate towards that person more than the band as a whole. And if that person can break off and do their own thing and not have to deal with everything else that comes with being in a band, most people are going to jump at the chance. Like the perfect example of that is Michael Jackson. I mean, he started in a band, a very, very, very successful band, and they were family. So if anything, that should have been even more of a reason for them to kind of stick things out and work things out and work together, because they are family and on a deeper level than just some people that were put together. But the money, the success, the like wanting to grow yourself on a different level outside of what everybody else in the band might want, is going to come from being a solo artist. And like, if he did not break off, we wouldn't have Michael Jackson. Like,
that kind of drove interest in them, many of whom I could mention by a single name, and a lot of you would know exactly who I'm talking about, just because of how legendary these figures are.
Freddie Mercury.
Be they Cobain or Cornell or Vedder or Mercury, Reznor, Halen, York. So it's not like this fixation on, this focus on, this obsession with
Neil Young. Like, there's just so many. It's always been ingrained into music and just people in general, is that you're going to gravitate towards typically the leading person in a band.
Very captivating
Nicole Scherzinger. Like, it's endless.
Individuals in the world of music in bands is anything all that new. I mean, I think we're seeing just as much of that now as we ever have, but what's changed is that the creative process through which many people make music is just vastly different now than it was decades ago. And why would you be in a group of people who all collectively need to make music or make a track or make whatever when you don't really need to be? Because
exactly, like, especially like when you talk about like technology and like how far music has come, like, you don't need full bands anymore. You don't need to hire a ton of different people to create music and create songs. You can do it by yourself with a laptop. So that right off the bat kind of breaks down the barrier so much. And like, people are wondering why there's no bands, because like before it cost a lot of money to get into music and to be successful in music. But now, because the barrier has been lowered so much, you're seeing so many artists pop up seemingly out of nowhere with them and maybe one other person, or just them and a laptop, and just coming up with music that just happens to resonate and catch on, because you don't have to bring together this full contingent of people to make music anymore. And if you can avoid that cost and that headache and difficulty, why wouldn't you?
Economically and creatively speaking too, that's just sort of inefficient. I mean, thanks to tutorials, thanks to various types of production technology, often one or two people can do the job of 4, 5, 6, or 7 individuals in the studio years ago. So of course, with that being considered, you're going to see a lot of collaborative dynamics kind of breaking down a bit over time, because these days it's just easier to do more with fewer people. I mean, not only that, but as I was kind of inferring earlier, it's a matter of economics too, especially in a music industry where primarily artists are making money off of their music through streaming, which notoriously does not pay very well.
Basically dying. Streaming is basically dying, and there's no real way for you as an artist to make a significant amount of living off of, unless you are already a massively established act, which if you want to feel my opinions about that, we also talked about in our last Let's Chat stream and have a full kind of clip and breakdown about the music streaming business you can check out on our YouTube.
Well, at all, with many even mid-tier artists, if they're lucky, making like $10,000 a year in royalties off their streams. That $10,000 tends to not go quite as far when you have to split it between 5 people. So in that sense, by forcing yourself into a band as opposed to more of a solo career or a duo, something like that, you could potentially be doing a disservice monetarily to yourself and your career. But also on top of that, this very same technology, as well as digital communications, makes it really easy to collaborate in a wider variety of ways than just like having 4 guys just locked into a sweaty, smelly studio for hours. Here's my track, here's my beat, here's my chord progression, here are my lyrics. What could you add to them in the DAW? Send it back to me over email. We're passing.
I mean, and a big reason why bands are not as successful or as mainstream successful as you would have experienced and expected as in the past is also because just the logistics of everything, of having to bring everybody together to just create music at the speed at which music and at the speed at which people consume music and opinions change. If you have to do that every single time to create music, you are going to be behind the ball. Like that is honestly why pop artists, hip hop artists, like these indie musicians are able to kind of shift the consciousness and the zeitgeist of music into that kind of their direction and impact the culture so much at such an incredible pace, is because they don't need to bring together like this entire contingent of people to make music, get schedules together, get mixed. Like you can just go in to your room, get on your laptop, get whatever equipment you need and create a song. And have that song be out within a week, if not within a day. And you can kind of shift and change with the kind of changing tides of music. Whereas if you're a band, you always got to get people together to create music. And like it takes just a much longer time to put out music at the pace at which music is consumed. You're always going to be behind. So until you can kind of get like your own hardcore fan base that will wait for you to put out music whenever, like people are just going to move on to the next thing. So it just makes, you're already kind of starting off at a disadvantage compared to somebody who doesn't need to have 4, 5, 6 other people in a room or exchanging ideas and mixes and breaks and everything to create a song.
Files back and forth, where communicating and working on a song together without even having met face to face. So again, it's not like the art of collaboration is like completely gone now. It's just that there are more convenient ways to go about doing it than locking a bunch of dudes together into a contract for life, essentially, and calling it a band. And even when you have an artist who maybe wants to go for a little bit of a rock thing on their album, or that's just kind of their overall aesthetic and vibe, like Olivia Rodrigo, for example, when you want that sort of sound, you want that sort of energy, you often find a producer who could just sort of like conjure it all together themselves. Again, with far easier and more widespread access to various types of production technology, the sound of entire rock bands can be conjured by one person. And lastly, I feel like a bigger and more important question in all of this is the music that we're hearing still good, regardless of whether or not it's coming from a band or a single person? Even though rarely again is that single person working entirely alone, because behind them there is often a team of writers and producers and various collaborators. I was very much alive and conscious during many of these huge musical eras for bands, and while some of my favorite groups did come out of those eras, some of the worst music I've ever heard in my life is coming from...
Yeah, why you always gotta shit on Nickelback and Godsmack like that? Show some respect, Fantano.
From these bands that we miss so much too. Personally, I still find on a regular basis a lot of great music, but if you're looking for it to just basically slap you in the face on the charts, you may in fact be looking in the wrong places, especially given just how homogenized and major label focused a lot of streaming platform algorithms are these days, which in my opinion is a way bigger detriment to creativity and the current day music landscape than whether or not there are bands.
Facts, because quite honestly, like, again, streaming has changed everything. Everything. The whole model of music, the whole model of releasing music has changed because of streaming, because it's so instant, it's so available, and there's just such a wide absolutely endless amount of it. The pace at which you have to release music and keep people's attention, especially if you have not cultivated that fan base or that following or hit the road or like built that core base, it's detrimental to be a band. And it's much, much harder for them to break through. And when they break through, it's like, okay, cool, they're here. Like, let's say who's probably one of the biggest bands out there right now, like 21 Pilots. Like, you haven't heard from them in a while. Like, you hear from them, but you haven't heard from them. Like, you don't hear from them on a consistent basis like a lot of these other acts that can just drop loosies at any given moment. And it's just the way that people consume music these days is not conducive for that model of release. So if you're looking for like straight up number one hits and successful and just amount of time they're going to spend on like the top of the charts, it's just not going to come from them because those charts shift and change so much. Not Like Us was made in probably like 6 hours. And it became the number one song of the summer. And it was number one for weeks upon weeks upon weeks. It's just the nature of it is that bands are always going to be at a disadvantage. It's just facts. There are still absolutely some phenomenal bands out there, and I love them, like Fontaine's DC, Turnstile, 21 Pilots. Like, they're just still a lot of absolutely fantastic band-based music. It's just like they're not going to have the same consistent reach as other artists that can put out music whenever they feel like. Just facts. So there's bands. You just gotta look for them more.